So my 23-year-old son, the alleged atheist, who has a super Catholic sensibility, looked at the list of speakers for this conference I showed him, and he said, "Ma, that is a wrecking crew." So on our little wrecking crew today, it includes Ken Woodward, who is, of course, the longtime religion editor from Newsweek, winner of the National Magazine Award, and crucially, my fellow Notre Dame grad. Yeah. Then we have Vinson Cunningham, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he's also a theater critic. And he teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence and worked in the Obama White House. And we have Father Matt Malone on the end here, the editor-in-chief of America magazine, who, when he was appointed in 2012, was the youngest EIC ever of the magazine. So thanks so much for being here, all of you. And I think we'll start off with Ken.
Okay. You've all been here a while. Until today, this conference has dealt largely with the Catholic imagination as it relates to the arts, especially literature, also visual, which is only right. The notion of a specifically Catholic imagination did not originate with theologian David Tracy's analogical imagination, much less with sociologist Andrew Greeley's later book, built on Tracy, The Catholic Imagination. Okay. It really began in the late 1940s and the early 50s with essays like Alan Tate's The Symbolic Imagination, Flannery O'Connor's lecture on mystery and manners at Notre Dame in 1957, which I was very fortunate to attend. And books like William Lynch's Christ and Apollo, published in 1960. And I think hovering over all of this was the influence and the power of Jacques Maritain, from art and scholasticism, which was so important to Flannery O'Connor, as she wrote, through creative intuition in art and poetry, which I think came out in 1955 and was so influential, I know for a fact, Robert Fitzgerald, among other poets and writers. Nonetheless, there can be no denying the culture-forming power of religion, whether it be on the sensibilities of an individual artist or on the ethos of whole communities, like those many towns in the South where it often seems there's more Baptists than there are people. Either way, we're talking about religion's capacity to shape, partly in a preconscious way, how we structure our experience of the world and our hopes and aspirations within and beyond it. That's what I take the religious imagination to mean. My point this afternoon is this: whether you're an artist or a scholar or a journalist, merely curious or earnestly interfaithful, you cannot understand another religion, even another Christian tradition, unless you'll go beyond doctrine and practices and fully engaged with that tradition's religious imagination. History, I submit, bears this out. In his classic study, The Waning of the Middle Ages, Johann Huizinga, this is a book that was very important to me as an undergraduate and a graduate student, argues that one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation was the late medieval imagination, which brought the realm of Christ and the saints into smothering proximity with ordinary daily life, and the medievals' concomitant habit of crystallizing religious thoughts into images. From this perspective, the Reformation was a reaction that put God and the things of God at greater distance from this fallen world, thus allowing more space for human freedom and, of course, human folly, and a rejection of images and all other visual manifestations of heavenly presences in favor of the preached word. As you can see, Huizinga's historical observations align well with David Tracy's distinctions between the analogical imagination typical of Catholics, but not only Catholics, and the dialogical imagination, which he finds typical of the Protestant imagination. Another touchstone text for me as I try to understand and communicate different religious imaginings to the readers of Newsweek. And keep in mind, whenever I wrote something in Newsweek, even if it was about Catholics, of which there were many, it was always news to most of our readers. Could be the Adventists, could be the Mormons, whatever. The other book I want to mention is Eric Heller's Disinherited Mind. In one essay, Heller points to the famous dispute between Luther and Zwingli over the Eucharist. Was the presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and wine real, as Luther contended, or symbolic, which was Zwingli's position? In Heller's view, Zwingli's stand signaled a hugely consequential transformation in the Western sensibility, one in which the real was no longer symbolic and the symbolic became merely symbolic. For Heller, this amounted to, quote, a radical change in that complex fabric of unconsciously held convictions about what is real and what is not. Coming to the present, let's consider Pentecostalism, the world's fastest growing form of Christianity. Born in the USA and barely a century old, Pentecostalism strongly resembles, at least in this respect, late medieval Catholicism, as Huizinga described it, in that both exhibit a religious imagination in which God and the devil intervene for good or ill directly in human affairs. There is no space in the Pentecostal imagination for the concept of natural law or even the laws of physical nature, because these are, the latter are malleable to prayer, as anyone knows who's ever watched Oral Roberts on television, or Pat Robertson for that matter. Robert Orsi, who teaches religious studies up the street at Northwestern, has defined religion as, quote, the practice of making the invisible visible, and argued that the proper focus of religious studies, therefore, should be on what he calls the sacred presences that form the bonds, quote, between heaven and earth. He's thinking a lot of his Italian mother when he's talking about this, who was greatly devoted to the saints. His approach certainly accords well with the Catholic and Hindu religious imaginations, but also with Mormonism, though it's not so obvious, in not so obvious a way. For me, the Mormon imagination is best encountered in the vision of the afterlife elaborated by the prophet Joseph Smith. I didn't notice this until a Mormon friend told me this story. It's a story of a former prophet of the church who had a major problem to solve and prayed repeatedly to his deceased predecessor for advice, but without response. Finally, an answer came back with this apology. I'm sorry, I didn't answer sooner, but I've been so busy up here. Anyone who has close friends among the Latter-day Saints quickly realizes that the church keeps its members very, very busy all week long, because it's an ethos that's built on work. Not for nothing is Utah called the Beehive State. Joseph Smith's genius, though, was to answer the problem of death in the 19th century by imagining the next life as a continuation, under better circumstances, of this one. A place where Mormon missionaries, like the former prophet, would still be needed, where families would continue to expand and to cohere, and where those admitted to the highest of the heavenly kingdoms would work in order to progress to the status of divinity like their heavenly father and mother. Excuse me. Thus, the Mormon imagination is neither analogical nor dialogical, but literal, as evidenced by the Mormon murals in the church's Salt Lake City Center, or by the dioramas on display in its New York City Church Center, both of which make Soviet realism of the 1930s look like Cubism. But what can we say about the Protestant imagination? And some things have been said at this conference by Paul Schrader, which I found very interesting. It would help if Protestants themselves would tell us. But a recent Google search turned up no conferences like this one exploring the Protestant imagination, and only one book with that title, with that phrase in the title, and it was The Protestant Imagination from Calvin to Jonathan Edwards. It would seem particularly difficult to discern the religious imagination of Reformed Christianity, since the iconoclastic John Calvin and his fellow reformers stripped the altars of statues, figured stained glass windows, of symbolic vestments, of any other visuals suggestive of sacred presences mediating between heaven and earth. Thus, one cannot imagine New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art staging a show called Heavenly Bodies from John Calvin to Billy Graham. Yet I would argue that there is a palpable religious imagination to be discerned, even in preachers dressed in basic Baptist threads. Let me tell you a story. In 1972, Newsweek decided to put Billy Graham on the magazine's cover for the first time. And so I, as the writer, flew out to Los Angeles to interview Billy. We met in a television studio where Graham was reviewing a videotape of a recent crusade he held in Tennessee with President Nixon there as his guest. Truth is, he was boosting Nixon's presidential campaign, re-election campaign. I watched Billy watching himself preach, and then I asked him what he was experiencing, thinking perhaps he was second-guessing his doppelganger on the monitor. But that was not the answer I got. I quote, "I get so engrossed, Ken, I don't think of the man on television as me," he said. "I think of him as another person speaking because the Spirit of God begins to speak to me through him." Spirit of God is speaking to Billy through Billy on television. That was another aha moment for me. For Graham, for those who heard him, his performance resonated as a verbal sacrament, though of course he wouldn't use that term, one in which the Word made flesh becomes, through the medium of his own voice, the flesh made Word. In sum, it seems to me that we cannot fully appreciate the Catholic imagination unless we understand the Protestant imagination in its various forms. The problem, I believe, is that we have been looking in all the wrong places. We do not need eyes to see, we do need ears to hear. Protestant Christianity, particularly in its Calvinist forms, is essentially an oral experience. That experience takes its most expressive form, not just in preaching, but above all in its music. Indeed, I suggest that a robust taxonomy of the American Protestant imagination would be gleaned from a deep immersion in the music it has produced, from the psalmody of the Puritans, through the great Methodist hymns, especially of Charles Wesley, to the old rugged cross and that iconic celebration of revivalist experience of salvation, Amazing Grace. And let me leave you with this thought. The next time your parish liturgist wants to play Amazing Grace during Mass or afterwards, don't let him. Listen to the words. It's not part of a communal liturgy. It's when I got myself saved. It's a wonderful hymn. Hum it in the shower, sing it at a revival meeting, but it doesn't belong in the Catholic Mass. And if you don't recognize that, then anything I've said about the Protestant imagination hasn't meant anything to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I think this is fine. Excuse my laptop, but maybe it's a little easier to deal with it up here, or maybe not.
You can sit back here. You can do it here if you want.
I'll do it here. I think I'm fine. Okay. I think it's okay. Thank you so much all for being here. I would just talk a little bit about my experience of writing material with more or less religious content within the context of a totally secular magazine like The New Yorker, which is sometimes a very confusing experience. I've often had the experience of writing a piece. I wrote a piece about hell recently, and the response was often from people that are sort of stereotypically New Yorker readers who were like, "Thank you for writing about this fairy tale," like very condescendingly, and people who write for publications like that are sort of much more seriously religious than the New Yorker, assuming that I was some sort of condescending New Yorker writer who had written it in the attitude of those other folks. So often this sort of in the middle experience. But earlier this spring, earlier this year, that is, in spring, I was walking with some friends into a church near a big plaza in Mexico City. And inside, there were other tourists milling around, and there were several groups of old ladies kneeling and praying. And what I always remember about this church, though, is that around the perimeter was this incredible armada of statues and icons and great big candles huddled together. And on the walls, there were these great big paintings, and in glass cases, there's these little lifelike dolls meant to represent the dead bodies of obscure saints of whom I'd never heard. In one case, this huge cubicle case, there was a statue of a swarthy brunette Christ, and he's dragging his cross behind him, and the crown of thorns is sort of pulling out blood from his forehead. And his eyes were bugged wide, and his mouth was drawn to this grimace. And my friends, none of whom have spent much time at all in Catholic churches, were really recoiling from this. One of my friends was like, "This is grotesque." And spooked into reverence though I started kind of weirdly, but maybe predictably because of what I do, I started thinking about magazines. And I guess I should explain that. Whenever somebody asks me what kind of writer I am, I get a little flustered. I write theater criticism. I write celebrity profiles. I write web posts about basketball games. I write little considerations of photographs and other images that I find on the internet. I write long reported pieces. I'm working on a novel. I'm like always confused, right? But what I almost invariably say when I'm asked that question is that I'm a magazine writer, because I think a magazine writing, that is another way to say that you're often confused. In a magazine like The New Yorker, there's reporting and there's political commentary. There's all kinds of criticism. There are comics, right? There's all kinds of things. In other words, though, there are any number of portals into the world of the magazine, any number of windows into which a sort of reader can kind of climb. And one of my favorite things when I talk to somebody who's a reader of the magazine and has been for a long time is to hear not whether they read it, but how they read it. Some people go straight to the cartoons. Some people go straight to the goings-on about town blurbs, which I really enjoy writing, these like 140-word blurbs. Some people go straight to the reviews. The important thing is that a magazine, which is a purveyor in some senses of a total sensibility, it doesn't present itself as a monolith, but instead as an array of aspects and vantages, a row of windows for any reader to open and enter. And the way that I think about my work as a magazine writer is to achieve the kind of versatility or productive, fruitful confusion that can help to fill a form like this, to make your own private concerns and preoccupations open up just as the magazine opens up. And I find Catholicism to be something like that too. Ken mentioned Pentecostalism, a very brief religious history. I was baptized Catholic and then raised mostly Pentecostal from the ages of 10 until whenever I got to choose for myself again. But one of the great differences between those traditions that I've often found is two different expressions of freedom. In Pentecostalism and other charismatic religions, often the freedom that you see that's happening, somebody might be running around here and somebody's dancing over here and somebody's singing or making some other sort of verbal ejaculation, right? Things are happening all around you, but it all comes from a space of sort of, to me, it has seemed inner freedom. Everybody's accessing their channel of grace and making this kind of communication on their own. Whereas I've always found freedom in Catholic churches. What I love about Catholic churches as edifices is the sort of spatial freedom that happens. You walk in maybe a half hour before Mass and there's someone kneeling in front of the candles, and there's somebody looking at the painting, and there's somebody in front of a statue of a favorite saint, and there's somebody fingering their rosary, and there's somebody kneeling, right? That there's a spatial thing that happens before the more communal thing that everybody's coming sort of slowly to encounter. And so all those statues and dolls, all those paintings and pews and banks of candles in Mexico presented themselves to me, not as impositions, but as options. There are so many ways in, the nuances of song, the lives of the saints, the words of the catechism, the rhythms of the liturgy and Mass, and you can sit in your seat, you can drop to your knees, or you can walk around as I did regarding these statues with an odd mixture of horror and love. So when I think of how it is to sometimes write about religious ideas at a magazine like The New Yorker, I imagine a mansion within another mansion, a prism, one prism inside the other. Like I mentioned, over the past few years, I've written about hell. I reviewed a book about Pope Francis, a play by Tom Stoppard that had sort of everything to do with belief. I reviewed a concert documentary by Aretha Franklin, her Amazing Grace, her.
You're forgiven.
Yes, her tremendously un-Catholic Amazing Grace. But each one of those has had something more or less explicit to do with God. But often, I was telling a story just the other day that one of my colleagues, I was having dinner and I was saying, yeah, I'm working on this and working on that. And I had said nothing about religion or anything like that. And he's like, everything has to do with God for you. I was like, what do you mean? I thought I was disguising myself just a tiny bit better than this, right? But even in those moments when that presence is less obvious, I find that to be enabled somehow in the same way that I find the relationship between reality and my faith to be essentially a matter of interpretation, a sort of exegetical matter. In the same way, it's possible over time as people read a magazine and find their way into it to exercise that sort of interpretation in your work in that magazine. So that's what I hope that I'm doing in my work, and I hope we can talk more about stuff like that. So thanks so much.
We have a bit more people than table, so it's a difficult maneuvering back here. My brothers and sisters, it's really a great pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for this invitation. And I think as far as these opening statements are concerned, you're probably going to hear three different and distinct theses, but all of them important, and I think during the course of the discussion, we'll see how they're related. I am a Jesuit. I should begin with a confession, right? Appropriately enough.
We have our suspicions.
And when I think about that, when I think about my work at American Magazine, I think, first of all, of course, of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus. If you have ever been to Rome, then and you have ever visited the Church of the Gesù, the headquarters church of the Jesuits there, then you'll notice something interesting about it. At least I did when I first saw it. And that is, whereas the front of many, or probably most churches in Rome, is parallel to the street. The facade of the Jésus is perpendicular to the street. There's a way in which if you want to get beyond it, you have to go through it. You have to go around it. You have to confront it, in other words. That positioning is itself a product of the imagination of Ignatius of Loyola. His great innovation was not to found a religious order, because we had those, and they were doing just fine. Ignatius's innovation, the imaginative leap that he took, was to move the religious order from the outskirts of town to downtown, right at the intersection of the church and the world, right? He envisioned an order of men at the center of the action, as it were. And that act of imagination is what inspires, in some way, every work of the Society of Jesus. And it certainly inspires the work of American Magazine, which is now in its 111th year of publication. America is also situated downtown, or as we call it in New York, Midtown, right? But the location that we occupy is not a literal one. It's not a literal piece of geography. It is itself an act of the imagination. For the founders of America knew, both the country and the magazine, but in this instance, the magazine, they knew that the most important municipality was an intellectual one. It was that space in which ideas are exchanged and debated, what a later generation would come to call the public square. And so America, the magazine, was founded and set up shop overlooking the public square, right at the intersection of the church and the world. And we have been opining about what we see from our vantage point for, as I said, 111 years, for better or for worse. What do we see from that vantage point today? Well, I think we see many of the same things that you see. And since our charge is to offer commentary and analysis from a Jesuit Catholic perspective on public affairs, what we see first is the character and the conduct of the public affairs of this country, which is not so great right now. We see, I think, probably what you see, which is a public discourse that has really broken down and is structured and driven by ideological partisanship. Right? Now, I don't mean differences of opinion. A democracy presupposes differences of opinion. And actually, I think any human enterprise involves differences of opinion. What I mean is a partisanship that is driven by ideology, closed systems of thought, questions that answer themselves. In that sense, because of that, the closed nature of our partisanship, we are not arguing with each other. John Courtney Murray, the mid-20th century Jesuit theologian who was a contributor to American Magazine, he said that argument is actually a difficult thing to have because you have to share certain things in common, a shared set of premises, a common source for data, the facts of the matter. But most importantly, Murray would say, you have to have the freedom to be wrong. You have to enter into the public debate as a mode of encounter rather than mere confrontation. Right? So there is no arguing happening in the public square, and that is a vital threat to the health of the body politic. But if that's not disturbing enough, we actually see something even more disturbing than that from our vantage point, and that is too often in the church, we are thoughtlessly importing the categories of our secular politics and using those to structure our interactions with one another. That in a sense we are thoughtlessly mimicking in our ecclesial dialogue what we are seeing in the secular dialogue. Now, if doing that is a threat to the body politic, it is an even greater threat to the body of Christ, because the body of Christ is a different reality than the body politic. This is what I mean. The church is not a polis, right? And it's not one more agent organized for public action. Right? The church is in no way a private actor. I mean, we make truth claims that are ipso facto, that are objective claims to reality, right? And they are therefore public claims, right? The church is not a polis, it's a sacrament, right? Our unity does not reside in our allegiance to a shared set of propositions, but in our devotion to a person and to the actions that that person has taken in human history. Right? The ultimate source of our unity as Catholics resides in the person of Jesus Christ, who is the way and the truth and the life. And why is that important? Well, there are two competing notions of truth in the world, broadly speaking. One is that truth is it's an objective reality, and discovering and articulating what truth is a matter of making propositions that correspond as closely as possible to describing those objective realities. The other is that it's entirely a subjective or personal reality, that the individual is the maker of truth, rather than merely the discoverer of truth. But the teaching of the Second Vatican Council is clear and also ingenious, because the teaching of the Vatican Council says, a pox on both your houses, right? Truth is personal, but that person isn't you. That person is Jesus Christ, the way and the truth and the life. In reality, our unity resides in his person. That's precisely why we are the body of Christ. Why is that important? Because that should give us the freedom to be wrong. Right? And we can then discover anew that our engagement with one another can be structured around encounter rather than mere confrontation. And if we can do that, then we can hold up to the larger world a model for engagement that is different than the one that we see in the secular sphere. Right? In other words, truth is a someone. It's not a something. If it is a something, then it's a something that we will use to beat each other over the head. Right? We can therefore never claim to possess the truth. Our lives as Catholics, as disciples, our public witness as disciples, has to come from the reality that we merely hope that he possesses us, the one who is truth. Right? That alone gives us the freedom to engage, to break through the closed system of thoughts that closes off from one another, both within the church and without. That alone gives us the opportunity to really engage with the freedom to change, but also to be changed by those with whom we engage. In a sense, our task is to remember that the object of Christian discipleship is not to be right, it's to be holy. Thank you.
Hard to bridge that.
those were great. So, Matt, to your point about Catholic media and Catholics in media, sometimes unfortunately mimicking the culture instead of challenging it. Well, first, amen. I mean, when I look at Catholic Twitter sometimes, it's just not easy to tell the difference, right? It's instead of he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone, it's more like rock throwing all day long. So how do we get from that confrontation to encounter?
Well, can you hear me? In a sense, it's the work of conversion, right? I agree with you. I think that too often we see in the Catholic media and the Catholic press, we see patterns of engagement that are not different enough from what we see in the secular culture, that don't really reflect the reality of who we are. I mean, if people see First Things as Fox News, though it's not, and they see National Catholic Reporter as MSNBC, and they see America as CNN, then we have failed. We have failed, right? That is a failure of our imagination, right? And so in a sense, and the principal culprit here in our failure to imagine a different ecclesial reality is in large measure clericalism. But it's not necessarily the clericalism that we hear so much about. It's the clericalism that affects all of us. It's this notion that the church is someone else, right? That's fundamentally what clericalism is, right? That the church is someone else, and responsibility for its stewardship and responsibility for bearing public witness to what it proposes to the world is someone else's responsibility, right? And that can affect clerics as well as lay people. It affects all of us, right? So in a sense, I think overcoming that sort of built-in cultural habit will allow us to then be a different kind of church and bear a different kind of witness in the public square. But in the end, it is something that we are led to. It's the process of conversion, right? It's allowing ourselves to be possessed by the Lord, so that our disagreements with one another are not a dagger in our hearts, but a thorn in our side.
Either one of the rest of you want.
Can I speak to that for just a minute? That's all very nice, but I remember the Catholic Common Ground movement. I'm sorry. I remember the Catholic Common Ground movement, Matt, you recall that? And Joe Bernardine started that in this town. And I remember going to a meeting of that, and none of the conservative folks showed up. So somebody who was priest, who was head of the Catholic Health Association, took the part and made the conservative argument, which is a wonderful gesture. But there was this sense of contamination. You are contaminating my church, my belief system. So it's even rougher than the way you've described it seems to me. But there was no effort to come together. I could get together with Richard John Newhouse, and he said, you know, the important thing is we agree on the essentials. And he was not an easy guy often to get along with, but it could be done. I myself was born before these divisions occurred, and I'm just not comfortable for them for that reason alone. The point I really wanted to make in regard to this is, my impression is that the political world and its emotions and divisions have taken over the religious. I don't give a damn that, whether you're Catholic or not. I want to know if you're on my side politically. And I find, whether it's on Catholic university campuses or anyplace else, that it's these real or presumed positions, secretly you did vote for Trump, didn't you? You know, that kind of thing, that has swallowed what might be legitimate differences in understanding a common faith.
But that still leaves us with the question of how to get from where we are now to being advertisements walking through the world for the way, the truth, and the life, right?
May I just briefly respond? I would just say, Ken, that I think it's not nice. It's the opposite of nice. It's the radical reality of who we are as a church, and when we fail to live out of that, then what happens is precisely what you just described. Our whole discourse is structured in exactly the way that it is in politics. The word conservative, the word liberal, these are not in the gospel. They
Right.
belong to political science, right? And so the very power that has within it the ability to shift our perspective and to open us up to one another and to a new reality is that very thing that we always skip over or that we give lip service to. The deepest source of who we are is not a sentiment, right? It's a reality. It's a living person, or it is nothing. The church either is the body of Christ, and it is the Lord's instrument on earth, or it is nothing. There's no other choice here. And so I'm just inviting us to live out of that reality as a means of overcoming the very divisions you described.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. I just made me think of Stanley Hauerwas used to say, we Methodists, he taught at Notre Dame, he knew the Catholic scene well. We Methodists are so nice. We're so nice. And then he would say, yes, but the word nice is not in the gospel, which is true. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
What impact do you think that Catholic media and Catholic writers in secular media are having on some of our important debates? Like, for example, one that I write about most often is probably immigration and asylum, which I find what's happening in our country is just so frightening on that front. Do you think that, and that's a place where the institutional church really cannot be faulted, but does that come through? Is there an impact on the debate, or, you know, how do you see that?
I think it's, for some of the reasons that we've already talked about, I think it's hard to tell whether there's a sort of monolithic or like totemic role for Catholic media to play in those debates, precisely because, and this comes from a totally sort of, at least professional bystander's position, but as I watch the sort of the discourse that happens among publications, avatars of publications, it does seem that there is a sort of reproduction of the same over this issue, right? There's a sort of, it seems to me that there has emerged a kind of a Catholic nationalism that is sort of commensurate or parallel to someone like, not even parallel to him, is in some ways inspired by the person of someone like Steve Bannon, right? We've seen him try to directly inject himself into Catholic politics, and therefore, in some ways, Catholic editorial life. I think we've seen that happen. So it's hard. I mean, it seems to me that the one place where this would happen is the sort of editorial page. I always read the op-eds in America, and I always admire them for their charity and sanity and clarity. But there is a moment. It often seems to me where those perhaps more dispassionate statements that draw on the Gospels and draw on, the wonderful words of Pope Francis. He should, certainly with respect to immigration, he should be a beacon, because it seems to me that he talks about these things.
It's the very first thing he did as Pope.
Absolutely.
Lampedusa.
And sometimes that for lack of a better word, a better phrase, sometimes that attitude trickles down, but other times he then becomes the locus of further confrontation. So it's, I think it's equally chaotic, in some ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you're right. I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has been a really powerful and strong voice on this issue in the public debate. But I think that there is a way in which we can talk about our witness as Catholics only in this very narrow sense. We talk about what is in the pages of our periodicals and what the bishops are saying, what they're doing or not doing, But if our whole frame of reference is what the bishops are doing or not doing, they're either doing a great job or they're doing a bad job, then that's a form of clericalism, right? The reality of the church and its response to this issue, is those things that we often mention, but it's considerably more than that. There's a ministry of the church on every border, in every county on the southern border. There's a ministry of the church in every county on the southern border. That is first and foremost the response of the church, right? And that is itself I think the Catholic imagination at work, more so than these more tactical political interventions. What's that saying is, we are going to transcend. We're going to transcend the crappy time and space that is our politics, and go to work, right? And do something different, something that is transformative, right? Because in the end, it's not just a Catholic imagination at work, or I should say, when we're talking about a Catholic imagination at work, we're really talking about a sacramental imagination at work, right? We're going to make something real here, now, that transcends the crappy time and space that is our cable news lineup.
Angela O'Donnell said yesterday that she really sees the Catholic imagination being boosted by Catholic media, in part by reviews of Catholic works in Catholic media. Cultural coverage in much of the secular media, and for example, in my newspaper, has basically gone away, as all of our critics have been laid off. There's a lot of that kind of coverage. We don't review books anymore, period. Forget Catholic books. So what is the state of as we're struggling for survival, I should say, to state the obvious. So what is the state of Catholic media, and is it different from secular media?
Well, I want to step back from them, and I've heard all good news about the new review media at this conference, but it's all generated from within the fold, so to speak. As someone who worked in a secular magazine, and I wanted to say to Vinson here, there aren't many Catholics at the New Yorker. And David Remnick, having gone crazy over Elaine Pagel, shows that he doesn't know anything about this sort of thing. A little dig of mine. So I think you will find, as I found at Newsweek, if you're the only Catholic there, lucky is your opportunity, because you get to define what Catholicism is, because there's no competition for it. Whereas in America Magazine, there might be. No, but so they pay attention to you. I'm really more worried, less about the political that we've been talking about than I am about not only the cultivation of a Catholic sensibility and a Catholic imagination, but even introducing and passing this along with other elements of the faith. It seems to me it's Catholics, through their institutions of higher learning especially, simply are not doing that. Melinda and our alma mater would never have a course on modern Catholic writers. It doesn't happen. You'll get the same sort of thing you'll get from any other English department there. they're not going to read Dostoevsky with those kinds of eyes, much less read Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. How many of them ever heard of Flannery O'Connor?
Oh, Ken, I hope it's not that bad.
I'm afraid it is. Maybe Hopkins if they're lucky. So if you are not sort of if you will, passing on the Catholic imagination, that's not a healthy situation, and that's what I think the situation is. And I think Dana Joya was in a good position to see that, how there wasn't much in the way of the Catholic imagination at Catholic colleges and universities.
Several people have said that it's Catholic art, Catholic writing that will bring young people in particular back to the faith. Do you, if you don't see it happening in academia, and I'm not sure I totally agree, do you see it happening elsewhere?
I think that though there is certainly a, you mentioned Catholic Twitter, which is,
Scary.
yeah, and similarly dispiriting to me. It does, though, I think, reflect a larger, it seems to me that because of any number of factors, more people are up for grabs in many different ways, just ideologically. Like there are people picking up books of political theory and theology and all different kinds of things, because I don't think that the world over the past 20 years or whatever has lent itself to easy comprehensibility. So I think that there's this term online where you can be red-pilled. It means that it means that you can be tugged into some terrible ideology by sort of swirling deeper and deeper down the toilet that is the internet. Like you sort of wake up in the morning a nice, regular sort of suburban kid, and by the end of the day, you're like, you believe in 7 different conspiracy theories, and that's a very scary proposition. But I think that in some ways it's an obvious opportunity as well, right? And not just for any religion per se, but certainly for different works of art, works of literature. I mean, I think there are people are picking up all kinds of books that they hadn't before, because in some ways trying to find a new way to see the world. I think that's something to look at.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, and our attempts to answer that reveal something. It seems to me that, as I said, a Catholic imagination is a sacramental imagination, right? It's a different conception of time and space. If you want to know what a Protestant imagination is, it's what we're sitting in it, right? That's what this country is. It's the product of a Protestant imagination, with all that is good and all that is not good about it, right? The culture of this country is Protestant. So in a sense, it should be easier for us to say, these folks are really, breaking through and bearing witness to a Catholic understanding of reality. It should be easier for us to point to those people than it is, right? To me, it's the difference between the two is precisely that different conception of time and space. So if Bill Kavanaugh, who's I think a really great theologian, talked so much. He's talked a lot about this, but it's different readings of Augustine. You are the city of God and the city of man spaces, or are they phenomena, or communities that transcend time and space in a sense, right? In other words, can you point to it in the here and now, right? Or is it all mixed up? Maybe that's why we're going to have a second coming, right? I think Catholics resist that notion that you can point to one or the other, right? There's a reason why the Scarlet Letter is is set in Massachusetts and not in Milan, right? Right, so this already elicits a chuckle, right? Because the notion of it happening in Milan is absurd on one level, right? It's only in the Catholic Church in the United States do we have debates about whether you can share a stage with a public official who has a different view of this public policy issue than the magisterium of the church does. That doesn't happen in Spain. It doesn't happen in Argentina. I mean, the Pope, when he was in Argentina, he had to contend with a junta, right? So to me, you're going to, if we're talking about acts of Catholic imagination, we're talking about acts of sacramental imagination. So who are those artists and poets and writers and musicians and public figures who are calling us to a different reality, who are pointing to a different reality than the one that we currently inhabit, and not necessarily from just a purely critical point of view. And you know, that is the work of the post-Catholic ghetto, right? And so much of our confusion around this is because when we were all relegated to a literal or intellectual ghetto, Catholics, then it was easy to point to things and say that's Catholic and that's Catholic, and then over there that's not, right? Mm-hmm. It's harder today, but that should be a good thing. It's an invitation to reimagine really who we are, right? But on our own terms, not on terms that belong to a culture that is not actually Catholic.
Yeah, well, Matt, again, that's fine, but when I look at the Catholic higher education, the kids are going to Notre Dame and Marquette and Loyola for the same reasons they're going to state universities. They want to get themselves a job. There's not a lot, and the humanities are going down the drain, and I think what we're talking about is a large part conveyed through the humanities. It's going to be a tough haul for these people, for these young people, because the whole reason for going where they are, that has changed. The utilitarian, and necessarily so, given the extremely absurd cost of higher education, you're not going to reproduce that, and they're not going to learn that they're called to be different. They're not called to fit in. They're not called in just to get jobs. And that actually, as you are saying in an evangelistic tone, we're called to be different. We're called to be disciples of Christ. The implications of that for these kids, they're not aware of yet, that it really, really is not just a different labeling system, but a very, powerful, you need strength for the commitment and for the long haul. And maybe in the Catholicism that I grew up in, which was there were boundaries between the world, that was a very good thing because it was a filtration system. It allowed certain things to come in and it kept other things out. It really was an ideal situation because you have to be different from other people, sociologically speaking, or feel that you are, better or worse, I don't care. Before you can have any sense of cohesion. I think it's basic sociology. And I don't think Catholics have that. I think the boundaries are all gone, and there's a considerable diffusion of self as well as community. And I think that's what we're called to try to get over.
When religion is covered in mainstream media, it's almost always all about the politics of religion or the scandals of religious groups, and there's almost nothing in it about God per se. And yet I found super interesting what you said, Vinson, about your colleague telling you everything is about God for you, because that comes through in your work probably no matter what you're writing about. When I used to write a column for the Washington Post, people would often say, "Oh, I really enjoy your religion column," which was interesting because I didn't write a religion column. That wasn't, but that's how readers saw it. So I wanted to ask all of you how you think, you have said that, but how you think your faith does come through in your work.
We had a evangelical Dutch Reform editor of Time magazine, the religion editor of Time magazine, and I was doing the religion section at Newsweek, and the historian Martin Marty once said, sort of tongue in cheek, well, I read Time to find out what Protestants think, and I read Newsweek to find out what Catholics think. And I thought he was having fun with us in some way. He was actually talking about Henry Luce, who was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and he had sort of ascribed to all of Time magazine that even though the major religion writers in my day, earlier, was another guy from Notre Dame, as a matter of fact, and very good. He wrote the Is God Dead cover. People would turn to that. They wanted to hear to the religion sections, because they wanted to hear they wanted to see something out there that validated their own experience. I was amazed. I came in at Vatican II, and all the editors who were not religious, all they wanted to know is what's going on with the Catholic Church. So I used to say, what's your priorities? Well, the first priority is talk about Catholics. What's the second? Talk about Catholics. What's the third? Talk about Catholics. Fourth, well, maybe the mainline Protestants. And fifth, maybe the Jews, because there aren't that many of them, and so on. So they wanted to hear about it. In the second half of the 20th century, however, the media was saturated with religion and religion stories of all kinds of exciting kinds. I don't care whether it's the Berrigans or putting Paul Tillich on the cover or John Courtney Murray, or we did our annual Jesus covers. I did the life cycle of Jesus backward and forward before I left that place, because there were already new books about who is the real Jesus. It was out there. There were movements. When the bishops wrote a letter on the economy, people paid attention. Since the turn of the century, it's all gone. Although, as Melinda said, the issues are every bit as pressing as before. We're still at war. Look what happened, the worst economic turndown since the Depression. 9/11 happened. There are no voices. There are no religious movements that I can see, even though the times are every bit as perilous. And the cultural question is why.
I want to give you guys in the audience a chance to ask some questions. I'm sure you have some.
Thank you. Just in response to what you just said, and then also to what Vinson was saying about sort of the red pills, I've been kind of wondering if we're due for an age of people finding their way back to the church out of a sense of disillusionment. I think about the 30s and Merton and Dorothy Day and people who kind of looked around at the mess that had been made and went, I don't know, maybe I'll be Catholic now, because that felt like the only way to make sense of a nonsensical time. And I have wondered, our current moment feels insane, and if people, I guess my question is, it feels like an opportunity for people who are looking for some other way of understanding the world around them, that the ways that they have been told and the things that they have been taught to have faith in are perhaps flimsier and less sturdy than they had reason to believe. But I guess my question is, I sense the opportunity, but is there anything that the church can do to meet it? What is the church doing? What can the church do? What would you suggest the church do? There's a sea of young people who are looking around at, the climate and the stock market and sort of going like, help! How and in what way can we meet them?
I'll just say quickly, you are the church. Get your people together and do it. You don't need the bishops to do it. You need to do it. I need to do it. And the second thing is, thank you very much for articulating that hope. That really is the hope. Fragmentation leading to something, and yes, that's what Merton came out of in the 30s or 40s. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm 22. I consume a lot of digital media. Can you hear me? Good. And I see in my daily basis, I'm on Catholic digital pages, and just a few days ago, I was on Reddit. If someone knows Reddit, right? And I was on a Catholic space on Reddit, and people were posting like a picture of like a 19th century pope with like a quote that's like, "We hear a lot about human rights, but what about God's rights?" You see, like, and then you see on the same page there'll be like, "Today we commemorate the saint who defended Europe against Muslims," and stuff like this. And on another hand, you see, like in New York Times last November, there was a story about more Catholic news outlets publishing names of LGBT church employees, and then those employees having their cars slashed, their offices burned, and stuff like that. So I guess my question is, I see Catholic media, online media that's using the Catholic label, causing rhetorical violence or real violence against people. So I guess what can we do with media that is using the Catholic label that is causing real harm daily to people?
Well, first I would say, and I don't mean this in a flippant way, don't read it, right? Because it's toxic, and it is doing damage to people. And in a sense, it's the ways in which we're experiencing the world are different than they were, but there's nothing fundamentally new about what we confront. You know, if people are going to school and they have materialistic ends, and that's how they view their education, that's idolatry. We've contended with that since the beginning of time, and the church has resources to deal with that. I, for one, more often than not, I mean, I see a lot of all of that too. Sometimes that violence is directed against me or America or people that I know, people who work in America. More often than not, I'm simply enervated by being held hostage by these two factions. One who says the world is ending, and the other who says, no, it's just starting. It's just starting, just getting started today, as a matter of fact, right? It seems like the vast majority of us are held hostage by these two people, right? These two factions. And both of them only have a part of the truth. A properly Catholic imagination, I think, is one which sees the world as always ending and always just getting started, right? And because that's what a sacrament points us to. It points us to that reality. So I would say, first of all, don't read it. The problem with a proposition or an argument always lies with its premise, right? So you asked earlier what we've been doing at our magazine to try to have our faith inform our work. We started making decisions that not rejecting the outcome of arguments, but rejecting their premises. So as a practical matter, we stopped using the words conservative and liberal to describe Catholics in an ecclesial context. We just stopped doing it. We said that those words they're not biblical, they're not from Scripture, they are not used in the teaching of the magisterium, they are not a part of our tradition, they belong to politics. We're going to find other words to do it. But you know, the number of people who thought that would be impossible to do was huge. And I know because so many of them told me. They said, that's going to be really hard. I was like, no, we're writers. We'll find other words, right? But words that really belong to our tradition, right? Naming it for what it is, right? Not just using the language of our tradition to describe reality. It's not just a kind of social science, data-driven notion of materialism. It's idolatry, right? That's what it is. I like inclusive language. Idolatrous is a great inclusive word. because we all have idols. We all have idols. And the moment we think that it's somebody else, right, that's the problem, then we've taken one step towards creating one.
I think what you said about just don't read it is more important than a lot of people realize. How that the news consumer has more power than he or she knows, because you will get on media what you consume. So people, I often see complaining about the low level of what's available, and it's because of the popularity of the low level of what's available. Again, just last thing on Twitter, the other day I was watching some smart Catholics sort of tear each other apart on Twitter and talking about I'm blocking you and I'm blocking you. And I said, oh, who would Jesus block? 2 seconds later, somebody messages me back, Jim Martin, of course.
I would like to preface my gentle remonstrance by saying that as old as I am, I have read New Yorker, America, and I kept my subscription to Newsweek because of you, Mr. Woodward.
How much do I owe you, but thank you.
Second Foley Prize winner in America's poetry contest back in 1970. In America when I was a Jesuit scholastic in 1965. And you got it wrong. Amazing Grace has to be sung in the Catholic Church for all the reasons you brought up. I want to hear someone sing it to say, I was lost and now I'm found. I was blind and now I can see. Because my grandmother, my mother, and my father and I have been waiting for the white Catholic Church to sing that song. In fact, in 1972, when I was ordained in East St. Louis by the only black Catholic bishop we had, because I thought the people needed to see another imagination of church, my Baptist grandmother had to sit there in a ritual that I made her feel comfortable with, because I had the people that eventually became the St. Louis Jesuits sing Amazing Grace as a responsorial. It made her feel comfortable. Now, the other remonstrance from a historical point of view is Pentecostalism. It comes from the ring shout that came from Africa. The spirit possession of everyone in the community was an expected outcome of prayer and song and dance. The Pentecostalism that you all mentioned that is just barely 100 years old is actually quite older than that, because the AME church split into Pentecostals and AMEs when Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne said he no longer wanted fist and heel and cornfield ditties being sung in his church, and he wanted them gentrified. I'm only saying that because quite often the voices of the people who created in blood and death liberation theology on this continent, enslaved by Africans, by Jesuits, visitations, and all sorts of other people. As a brilliant commentary yesterday morning talked about the Catholics who were the instigators of the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. And all of the Union soldiers who came out of Florida and other places who were Catholic and sang Catholic spirituals in order to prepare themselves to go and get killed in the Union and the Civil War. I'm saying this because I heard so much that I agree with and love to hear from you three people. But my history got kicked to the curb over Amazing Grace, since that was a song that John Newton heard sung by slaves, and he put his conversion text to it. It's got to be in the Catholic Church.
Well, let me respond that my Baptist father would have felt more comfortable when he accompanied my mother to Catholic Mass if he heard it. Now, we know that Amazing Grace, starting with Newton, got changed. The music was changed, and the words, verses were added. Those were changed. It's been a malleable product. But as the hymn stands now, all I'm saying is if we could change it to not I, but we were lost and we were found, that's a communal liturgical expression, which doesn't preclude in other settings singing I. That was my only, that's my only point on that. But the relation, I don't want to go into a long detail, but I have an interview with David Tracy coming out in Commonwealth, and we talk about it there. It's that the relationship between grace and salvation in the Protestant imagination and in the Catholic imagination are different because we're not totally lost. It's the late Augustine's totally lost, but not the earlier one. No, grace perfects nature. It doesn't take its place. And that's a real theological difference between the Catholic and Protestant tradition.
We're over time already, but do we have, I think we had one last question over here.
Hi. So I can't really follow that. That was brilliant, but I am going to follow it with another hard question. And this is for Matt, about America magazine.
Yes.
So I like a lot of things you said, and I'm actually thinking about what you said about liberal conservative. That's really interesting, and I agree. But I find it interesting because earlier this year, your magazine told me that you wouldn't publish a story that's not pro-life. And the term pro-life is also political and doesn't belong to the Catholic faith. And so I just wanted to know, because when I look at your magazine, and on the issues of abortion, birth control, anything related to reproductive health, just pregnancy in general, that would impact Catholic women, I rarely see reported pieces. I don't see voices of Catholic women. When I do, well, I see some editorials on abortion from Catholic women that never had an abortion. I never see interviews with Catholic women that use birth control, never seen interviews with doctors, etc. So basically, I don't see the intellectual debate on reproductive health issues in your magazine, but I see it on a lot of different issues. So I want to know if that was a conscious editorial choice, and if so, like, what's the thinking behind that? Are you doing a disservice both journalistically and to the Catholic women that read your magazine?
Sure. Thank you for reading, first of all, and I appreciate your question. I think we do believe in having a diversity of voices in our pages, and I'm proud of the fact that we have had more. We currently employ more women, and we have more women on the staff of America and in the pages of America than probably in the 100 years before the last decade. We, in fact, last year, we were the first issue of a Jesuit journal to have it entirely edited and written by women, and we were the first Jesuit journal to have the most comprehensive survey of American Catholic women ever conducted. We do believe in hosting a diversity of voices, but we also have values, and we have an identity as a Catholic organization. And America's editorial line aligns with the magisterium of the Church on the issue of abortion and reproductive health. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. And if somebody told you we don't publish articles that aren't pro-life, they should not have put it that way. I think that, first of all, there is no category of articles except for the most extreme, and I think we would probably all agree on what those are, that we would not publish in America. It's a question of how you do it and how you put that piece in dialogue with the other pieces, but also in a way that accurately reflects the point of view that we have as a journal of opinion. We actually have an opinion of our own as well. but there are ways in which you can do it. And on another range of issues, we just did it. We have 111 years of editorials and content opposing communism that I published to communists, making an argument for why that was compatible with Catholicism. There are ways in which to do it. It's an editorial judgment about how you do it and when you do it, but there is no absolute prohibition on an entire genre of writing.
Thanks to everybody for coming. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming.